So, this is the stack of books that I currently have to review. Um, yeah, it's a bit varied, but there's a reason for that. I am of the opinion that even if you are generally doing a deep dive on a given subject, it is very easy for people to over specialize. Um, and I find that even in the sort of esoteric community, this is still weirdly true. And I think when you do that, you miss a lot. You miss a lot of possibilities of understanding. You miss a lot of developments that are happening in other fields they may seem unrelated to what you're working on, but they actually do have meaning for what you're doing. So, while I did receive some nice comments on my unboxing of Celestial Intelligences, and there will be further unboxings of similar sorts of books, and probably even from some from Anathema, I am not going to be exclusive to that subject matter. And you'll see that starting with these reviews, because I do believe that they are it is important to be getting information and insight and perspective from seemingly unrelated fields, but yeah, I'll discuss some of that when I get to it. So, today's review, I will be starting with the J. Philip Newell book on top. These are not actually stacked in order of the reviews I'll be giving. I stacked them in order of size, just so that the little pile would be stable. But I will be starting with the Newell because it is a short, brief one. That's what I'll do in this video. And then the other reviews, some of them will also be pretty short, but they will be in their own videos just for ease of finding them in the future. Hey, popping in during editing, I just want to make sort of a correction. In that stack of books you just saw, one of the books was William Cooper's Behold a Pale Horse. That will not be reviewed in this upcoming selection of book reviews. I'm actually postponing that to a date to be determined later. I will explain at that time. In short, I did not think I could give it a fair review right now, so I'm going to try again later when I'm not overflowing with rants. Yeah. So if you are actually interested in a review of that, I'm sorry. It'll come eventually. I don't know when, but it's not going to be in this first selection of book reviews. Okay, back to this actual video. So for the first book review, I am reviewing a very slim book, Listening for the Heartbeat of God, a Celtic Spirituality by J. Philip Newell. This is a very short, brief overview and introduction to at least one thread of Celtic spirituality. And it starts with Pelagius, who was unfortunately eventually declared a heretic. But I think if you go into the study of a lot of what are called heresies, you will find that a lot of times it is hard to agree with the arguments given for why they were heresies and therefore not acceptable. Sometimes the arguments do bear out. Sometimes they really don't. I think Pelagius is one in this case where we really could have used his insight and the insight that might have come from more open study and consideration of his ideas. And what this book is, it traces some of the ideas of Pelagius through from his time through to the 20th century. And it also sort of compares what the author calls the sort of traditions and ways of St. Peter versus the traditions and ways of St. John. And so it's a lovely book. It's a very quick read. You can easily do a chapter a night and still have, plenty of, it's not going to take you that long. Because it is so brief, it doesn't go into what we would consider to be scholarly depth on any of these ideas or any of these people. And it's not supposed to. So that's not a critique. I'm just saying this is the point of this book. The purpose of it is to give you launching points, places to start. If you are interested in looking into a version of Christianity that is that might have been something radically different from what became the mainstream. One thing that it also sort of reminds you of is that there's this tendency in, at least in the Roman Catholic Church, which is then exacerbated by the Protestants. And the Orthodox Church isn't so bad about this from what I've seen, though I could be wrong on that. But the tendency is to say that if an area has adopted a people, right? Whether the Irish or the natives of Peru or wherever, if they have not adopted our version of Christianity, then they have not been, the good news has not been taken to them, and that they have not been exposed to Christianity, and therefore they're basically pagan. You see this with the Roman strain of Christianity, especially in what is being discussed here. Unfortunately, the Protestants take that and turn it up to 11, where if missionaries go into an area and the native people are practicing a form of Catholicism, they say, oh, yeah, that's basically paganism. We need to evangelize these people because they've not been properly evangelized. And you see this again and again. And this is a lot of the process of what happened here. There's this idea that if the missionary strain didn't come from, at the very least, the Catholic, the Orthodox faiths, or some might say better yet, the branched Protestant faiths or religions, if you will, that it's not Christianity. And in Ireland, so therefore, if it's not of the tradition of Peter, right, and all of Protestantism and Orthodoxy, it is all of the traditions of Peter. I would, as this book puts it, I would personally specify not even Peter. It's the traditions of Paul. He is the major influence in all of the Western Orthodox, which is, Roman Catholicism, the Eastern Orthodox, and then every offshoot from all of those, including all of the at least the mainline Protestant branches and everything that branches off from there. But there were 12 apostles. And honestly, I don't count Paul even as one of them. So you had Thomas going to India. You had John, he ends up in the Mediterranean, but he was knocking around in there. You even had other disciples. You had, the British tradition and legends hold that Joseph of Arimathea had very tight connections with Wales and the southern part of the British island. And so therefore there already was Christianity in these areas before the specifically Roman influence showed up. And you have this tension for many centuries between, and this is something that's really illustrated in this book, between the Celtic approach to Christianity and the Roman. And I know a lot of historians will discount the Council of Whitby. Oh, that was just about, how to set the date of Easter and calendars and things like that. But I think a lot of times in history we have moments where the immediate debate is something small and minor. But behind that debate and hinging on that debate is much greater questions. And I think that's what we have in the Council of Whitby, where you have the ostensible question is, when will we set the date of Easter? What method will we use for calculating when it happens? But what's really going on is you have the decentralized Celtic Christianity, sort of in the tradition of John, versus the much more hierarchical and authoritarian Petrine, again, I would call it more of a Pauline traditions from Rome. And unfortunately what happens is they leave it up to the king. They say, here's our arguments, O king. Who wins? The problem is, of course, that when you say to a king, choose between greater authority and power or more decentralized power, no matter what the ostensible question is, they will reliably, unless they are literally some kind of saint or inhuman being from heaven, if they are human and if they are human men, bless them, but they have these tendencies, they will almost always go to greater authority, greater power for authority versus greater decentralization. And that is what happened in the Council of Whitby. And from that point on, the Celtic approach loses power, it loses sway. And then the following centuries are again and again and again and again the Roman Church cracking down on the natural impulses, the natural spiritual impulses of the Celtic people, especially in Ireland and Scotland, but also in all the places where the Celtic tribes had been, and where their descendants were living. So I think for that whole subject, because it does give you a lot to think about. I think the thing about this book is it gives you the launching point and the introduces you to initial people, initial writings, initial ideas, but it's turning them over in your head and sort of like seeing where the threads in your own mind go. the sort of what could have beens, or what are the results of these actions that aren't discussed in the book. For instance, if the natural spiritual tendencies and inclinations of a people are for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, despite them bouncing back, for all of those centuries are suppressed and crushed, what does that do to the psyche of the people? And how does that manifest? And I think that is definitely something I know the First Peoples and Native tribes in America have been really discussing and bringing to the fore. And I think you find a lot of the same patterns in Ireland, in Scotland, in these places where the authoritarian Petrian church really had to crack down. And I think that's something worth exploring. This book doesn't. This book doesn't talk anything about the Native Americans. It's very focused. It doesn't talk a lot about the consequences of what was done. That is left to the reader. But it is something I think the reader should think about. So, all told, a simple little paperback. It's not, this is not a book I recommend necessarily for its physical beauty as a lovely object. But as an introduction, as a launching point, or even a brief overview and introduction, just not necessarily because you're interested, but you'd like to know a little bit about this, and see if maybe for your own studies, there might be something of interest. I think this is a very good book. I will say, due to its nature, again, that not only is this not an in-depth scholarly work, it is, and it's not supposed to be, neither is it supposed to be a particularly balanced or unbiased. Now, I don't find the bias in the writing to be super obnoxious. I don't find it to be unfair, but do keep in mind that everything he presents, you will find other opinions and you will find other perspectives on these things. And I recommend, if you read this and you like it, look into those too. And that will help give you a much fuller understanding. So, would I recommend this book? For what it is, yes. As an introduction, as an overview, I think it's really excellent. It gives that launching, it gives that very basic context, and this person existed, this is who he was and what he did, and here's some of his ideas, or here's this collection of writings that exist, here's where they exist in history, here's who we think wrote them, here's some excerpts, and here's where to go for more information. There is not an index, though for something this brief, and because it is so well organized in the terms of chapters, you don't necessarily need an index. There are notes for every chapter, so when you do want to do further research on something, you absolutely can. So I would recommend it for the overview, introductory aspect of it. I would not recommend, if you're looking for an in-depth scholarly, really get into it, that is not this book. But this is good for the book you read before you read all those other books, to give you the overview and the context. Here is a little bit about the author. The Reverend Dr. J. Philip Newell is a warden of spirituality for the Anglican Diocese of Portsmouth. He is a Church of Scotland minister who has served at St. Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh, and as warden of Iona Abbey. His books include the Iona Community Worship Book from Wild Goose Publications, An Earthful of Glory, SPCK, and Celtic Prayers from Iona, Paulist Press. And this book in America is published by Paulist Press. So for what it is, I would recommend it. Just keep in mind that you're not getting, this is not a tome. This is not an encyclopedic, is that the word? It is not super in-depth, but it is an excellent beginning, an excellent launching point. So, yeah, for what it is, I do recommend it. It was a lovely read, an easy read. You don't have to be a scholar to understand what he's talking about, and a read that hopefully will spark some thoughts in the reader, and get the reader to think about some things. All right, so on to the next review.